Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating, honestly kind of mind-blowing historical theme. How exactly do powerful empires and states manage to consolidate control over massive amounts of land and people? We usually picture history as this series of dramatic, sweeping battles, right? But as we're going to see, the most enduring forms of control, they're usually established not with swords or gunpowder, but with administration, paperwork, and laws. It really boils down to this fundamental question that every empire or ruling class has had to figure out. How do a very few control the many? How does a tiny group of outsiders suddenly control a massive population? When you look closely at the history of modern statecraft, a distinct pattern starts to emerge. A playbook, basically. And the answer rarely relies on just winning on the battlefield.
Okay, let's dive right into this playbook. There's a basic contrast here that literally changed the course of history. See, physical force, sure, it works in the short term, but it is incredibly expensive. It requires constant resources, huge armies, continuous conflict, the whole shebang. On the flip side, legal and administrative systems, they're cheap, they're highly efficient, and they're self-perpetuating. Once you change the law or tweak the administrative structure of a society, you fundamentally change the ground rules of daily life.
So, to see this playbook in action, we're going to walk through 4 key chapters. First, enclosing the commons. Second, ruling through local leaders. Third, the myth of empty land. And finally, the enduring legacy. Chapter 1. Enclosing the commons, the economic foundation. We're going to start by looking at the drastically changing rural landscapes of 15th to 18th century Britain. To really make sense of what happened here, we're looking at a concept Karl Marx famously called so-called primitive accumulation. Just to define this impartially based on the historical analysis, it's basically the process where a freeholding peasantry was systematically separated from the land they lived and worked on. Now, why is that absolutely crucial? Well, to build an industrial, factory-based capitalist system, you need a huge, pliable workforce, a proletariat, who literally have no other way to survive except by selling their labor for wages. And you definitely don't get that workforce if people can just comfortably live off their own land. Now, what's really interesting about this timeline is the staggering scale of the transformation. In the 15th century, the vast majority of the British population were free peasant proprietors. They had the right to use common lands for grazing, timber, firewood, you name it. But as the price of wool skyrocketed, the nobility suddenly wanted that land for sheep. So, hitting the 16th century, we see the forcible usurpation of these communal lands. And by the 17th century, that raw violence evolved into neat administration. Acts of Parliament were passed for the enclosure of the commons, basically a legal decree turning shared earth into private wealth. This whole process peaked in the 18th century with the massive clearing of estates in the Scottish Highlands, where huge populations were just entirely swept off the land.
The poet Oliver Goldsmith actually captured the profound heartbreak of this era in his 1770 poem, The Deserted Village. He wrote, "But a bold peasantry, their country's pride, when once destroyed, can never be supplied." This wasn't just some abstract economic shift we read about in textbooks. It was a massive human tragedy. Entire communities, uprooted by the simple stroke of a pen.
The ultimate result of the enclosure movement was this profound structural transformation. It took a rural population of independent farmers and turned them into a concentrated mass of wage laborers, with absolutely nothing left to sell but their own labor. This laid the absolute foundational groundwork for industrial cities like Birmingham and Manchester. It provided the exact abundant workforce that the new factory-based manufacturing desperately needed to get off the ground. Chapter 2. Ruling through local leaders. The global empire. So we've seen domestic economics. Now let's see how colonial powers solve the problem of administering massive populations overseas on a really tight budget. During the height of colonial empires, European powers faced a really practical hurdle. They simply didn't have the money or the manpower to directly control these vast new territories. So 2 distinct philosophies popped up. The French went with direct rule, a centralized, uniform, kind of Jacobin approach meant to assimilate colonial subjects into the French polity, swapping local laws out for French ones. The British, though, they leaned heavily into indirect rule. As British Prime Minister Lord Salisbury famously put it, it was cheaper, simpler, and it spared unnecessary contact. The British basically supervised from behind the scenes, while the actual day-to-day government was left to traditional local rulers. The ideological architect for this British model in Africa was Frederick Lugard, the High Commissioner of northern Nigeria. Lugard conquered the Sokoto Caliphate, which was a massive territory, but he had incredibly limited resources. Fortunately for his administration, the Caliphate already had a highly developed, super-efficient system run by emirs.
So Lugard's system worked like this. The British would control the military, external affairs, and the taxes. In exchange, the emirs kept their traditional powers over the people. And if a region didn't already have a traditional leader, the British would just invent one, appointing warrant chiefs who suited their needs, while modifying any local customs they deemed repugnant.
Now, while this was definitely cheaper and easier for the Europeans, it had massive, massive consequences. The academic Mahmoud Mamdani famously coined this system of indirect rule as decentralized despotism. Academics point out that by propping up conservative elders and traditional leaders, this system entirely marginalized the younger intelligentsia and locked in rigid social divisions. So what looked like indirect rule was really just a highly effective tool for foreign extraction, and it fueled persistent ethnic tensions that are honestly still shaping contemporary governance in these regions today.
Chapter 3. The Myth of Empty Land. Controlling the Narrative. Let's move over to the Americas now and see how this builds into the ultimate legal and psychological tool of dispossession.
Consider this incredibly stark reality from the U.S. National Park Service regarding westward expansion. To settlers, immigrants, and homesteaders, the West was empty land. To Native Americans, it was home. I mean, that really gets to the core of how legal narratives shape our reality. You have two completely conflicting realities existing at the exact same time, but only one of them is officially recognized by the administrative state.
The logic here is breathtakingly simple but devastatingly effective. By officially, legally declaring occupied territory as, quote-unquote, empty, as public domain, just ready for homesteading, the administrative state effectively erased pre-existing indigenous claims to the land. The Homestead Act wasn't a military campaign. It was just a law. It was an administrative stroke of a pen that incentivized a massive migration by turning an indigenous home into empty real estate. It is literally the ultimate example of paperwork superseding physical reality.
Chapter 4. The Enduring Legacy. Connecting the Playbook. Let's pull all these threads together to see the cohesive picture they form. So, the crucial point here is that a truly universal administrative playbook emerges whenever a few people seek to control the many. Step 1, you separate people from their resources exactly like we saw with the enclosure of the commons, which creates a dependent workforce. Step 2, you figure out how to administer vast territories on the cheap by co-opting local power structures, just like British indirect rule. And step 3, you use the legal system to totally justify the acquisition and erase any previous claims, which we saw with the myth of empty land. It's a brilliant, highly effective machinery of control.
Which brings us right up to the present day. These aren't just dusty historical anecdotes, right? They are the literal foundations of our modern world. The borders drawn on our maps, the property laws we all abide by, the bureaucratic structures of global governance, even modern economic inequalities, they're all direct descendants of these administrative mechanisms. So I want to leave you with this question to ponder. When you look at modern property lines and global governance today, whose historical playbook are we still living in? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope it sparked your curiosity, and we'll see you next time as we continue to unpack the hidden structures that shape our world.